fine line between
I think a lot of people in Eastern Europe go through this period by laughing a lot. Sorry about that.
So your daughter followed you?
center, that makes you center left.
Welcome, everybody. A very warm welcome to all those here in our conference room today, and also a welcome to those watching on FDD's live stream. My name is Toby Dershowitz. I'm Senior Vice President here at FDD. On behalf of FDD and our Center for Sanctions and Illicit Finance, we are so privileged to have all of you here, which includes members of the diplomatic corps, congressional staffers, officials from the executive branch, from the defense and intelligence communities, the think tank communities, and members of the press. As most of you know, FDD is a nonpartisan research institute focusing on foreign policy and a very wide range of national security issues. One of the issues our Latin America team has looked at is the illicit activity in the hemisphere by Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations. As we'll discuss here today, Hezbollah has increasingly become a narco-trafficking enterprise, which has been of deep concern, frankly, to successive administrations. My colleague, Emanuele Ottolenghi, has written about this extensively and has testified before Congress on this. Likewise, our very distinguished panelist, Derek Maltz, has testified actually as recently as 24 hours ago on this before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Derek, I just want to thank you for your years of public service, where you brought a no-nonsense, non-ideological, and very practical approach to these issues. FDD's research fellow, Tony Badran, one of Washington's most well-regarded experts on Hezbollah and Lebanon, will shed light on Hezbollah's leadership structure, while Emanuele and Derek will help us connect the dots to the decision structure with the illicit activities in Latin America and globally. I would say that it's fortuitous that we should meet today, when just hours ago, the Department of Justice announced the formation of the Hezbollah Financing and Narco-Terrorism Team to initiate prosecutions that will restrict the flow of money to foreign terrorist organizations and disrupt violent international drug trafficking operations. And I know this will be an important topic of our conversation today. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that we meet today just a couple of days before the third anniversary of the murder of Argentine prosecutor Alberto Nisman, who investigated the bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994. As many of you here know, this was the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentina's history. Nisman's trail of evidence led not only to local Hezbollah proxies, but directly to the most senior officials in Iran's government. 5 Interpol red notices remain to this day for senior Iranian officials and also for one Lebanese national. Nisman was due to present evidence before the Argentine Congress on January 19, 2015, evidence that he was to argue showed an attempt by the former Argentine head of state and her administration to cover up the role of senior Iranian officials in the bombing of the AMIA. Nisman was found brutally murdered in his apartment hours before he was to present his case. Alberto Nisman left behind an important roadmap for us, for law enforcement and the policy community, showing how Iran patiently recruits and deploys its cells in our very own backyard. Nisman uncovered Hezbollah's activities in Latin America. Hezbollah flaunts it, and it's up to us to learn the lessons from Nisman's work and from our own very talented law enforcement. As I look around the room, I see so many people who have focused on these issues over the years, and I'm eager to hear the conversation. I know the vast experience in this room will help us create a fascinating and informed conversation today. Before I turn it over to Jane Torrance, Deputy Managing Editor of the Weekly Standard, I ask the audience to silence anything that goes beep or buzz. And with that, I turn it over to Kelly.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I can't think of a more timely moment to have this conversation. As Toby mentioned, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced today the creation of the Hezbollah Financing and Narco-Terrorism Team. And I thought it was interesting that Department of Justice mentioned in their press release announcing this that the team will begin by assessing the evidence in existing investigations, including cases stemming from Project Cassandra, a law enforcement initiative targeting Hezbollah's drug trafficking and related operations. Now, as a journalist, I'm always happy to think of the influence that my industry might have, and I think in this case, there's no question that a December piece by Josh Meyer in Politico, and Josh Meyer's here today somewhere, really sort of shone the light on what happened during the Obama administration with Project Cassandra and what it means going forward. And I think that, I have to think that the spotlight that Josh Meyer put on that issue is certainly one reason I think that the Department of Justice announced this new team. And just a quick summary of some of the big stuff in Josh's piece. He quotes a law enforcement official saying that because Hezbollah's drug trafficking was bankrolling its Islamic Jihad military wing and joint ventures with Iran, it represented, and this is a quote, the largest material support scheme for terrorism operations the world had ever seen. This is an operation that is active on 6 continents. You've got Iran and Hezbollah obviously involved in Syria, as we know, and they're making moves into Yemen and other countries. But they also have networks in Africa that traffic not just in drugs, but also weapons, used cars, diamonds, even human slaves, according to the information that Josh found with Treasury Department documents themselves, as well as his interview with people who were on the Project Cassandra team. And Hezbollah and the Quds Force were also moving into China, and they're constantly looking for new markets, new places to make money. And also today, I thought was very interesting was Federica Mogherini of the European Union met with the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, along with Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, and they made an announcement that they are going to be continuing to make sure that the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is implemented and continues on a straight path. Now, one of the interesting things that was not mentioned at all in her press conference or press release about this is the protests that started in Iran on December 28th. And despite the fact they do seem to be at a bit of a low tide right now, but they certainly haven't stopped, and they are continuing. And if you listen, these protests started as touched off by some economic factors, but clearly the dislike of the regime went deep, and people recognize that the reason that they are seeing such terrible economic conditions is because the regime got these pallets of cash, as it were, and is not using them to help the people. It's using them to pay for the Revolutionary Guards and some of its foreign adventurism. And that's why you're hearing on the streets all over the country and in over 100 cities already chants like "Death to Hezbollah," "Leave Syria alone, think about us instead," "Never mind Palestine, think about us," "Forget about Gaza and Lebanon, I'll sacrifice my life for Iran." And to add just one more newsworthy item, as Toby mentioned, this weekend, and he's expected to announce something tomorrow, but it may be as late as Monday or Tuesday, the president needs to make a decision yet again on that 90-day, whether he's going to certify the JCPOA again. And this is certainly something that is very much related to what we're talking about today. And so I wanted to start with Tony Badran, who's, as Toby mentioned, a research fellow here at FDD. Now, a report from FDD's Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance last year was excellent, and it said that Hezbollah gets about $1 billion a year, and most of that's from Iran, about 800 million plus weapons, but they're also getting donations from people across the Lebanese diaspora, from smuggling, from drug trafficking. And one thing I thought was interesting is that, so in 2009, Iran cuts funding for Hezbollah by 40%, and that's because oil prices were declining and they were facing crippling sanctions. Well, then they started increasing money once the Syrian civil war started, and they were heavily involved there. And then 2014, they start cutting it again due to sanctions. But after the JCPOA lifted sanctions, they are now increasing their funding for Hezbollah. And so a couple questions is how much of the money that Hezbollah needs to do everything it's doing, is it getting from Iran and does it need to look for a lot of money elsewhere? And then maybe after you sort of give us an overview of that, I'd be interested in hearing about your comments on the Iran deal and how that might does it directly affect Hezbollah's activities as well?
Great, yeah, thank you, and thanks all for coming. It's the financing, Hezbollah financing and the relationship with Iran, we have to be careful about certain things. Like about a year ago when we passed the HIFPA, the congressional legislation to target Hezbollah financing, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, comes out and declares openly that basically every item that Hezbollah needs in terms of, clothing, weapons, he goes through a list and says everything comes from Iran, and he says it open, he says so openly. Now, people seized on that rightly, not that it wasn't particularly known or assumed to be the case, but it was an interesting thing because he sought to say that, to emphasize that at a moment when the Lebanese banks were under scrutiny. So in so doing, he sought to minimize Hezbollah's economic ventures, illicit economic ventures, in the Lebanese economy and the Lebanese state institutions and the Lebanese financial and real estate and other systems. So yes, the money that and the figures that we're seeing, which by the way fluctuate, and there's a fund from Ali Khamenei himself, and the person who has said this, by the way, is none other than Abdullah Safiyuddin, whom we were going to be talking about much more later, who said so in 2012 that the supreme leader devotes a dedicated budget from his estates to Hezbollah. This gets increased in moments of crisis. So if you, like after the 2006 war, when there was a lot of devastation in Lebanon, they upped the money. Now in the Syria enterprise, they upped the money. Which, by the way, it's not true that, I know there was a thing that came out that, that they were so bad financially that they were crowdsourcing their finance. No, okay, that was a social issue. It was not a financial issue. So they get it from multiple sources. It's important when we talk about how much they get from the Iranians, and this has relevance to the Iran deal that I'll come back to in a second. It's important not to underestimate the importance of Lebanon itself to their finances. And I'm not just talking about the banking system, which is only one aspect. The Project Cassandra and the Lebanese-Canadian Bank is an example. As far as I know, they're still smuggling cocaine, and these proceeds are going somewhere, right? They have to be processed somehow. And it's not just Lebanon, clearly. There are other banks that they deal with in the region. But it's a real estate market in Lebanon. It's also state institutions. It is the Lebanese airport. It's the Lebanese naval port. They control these places. They can bring in stuff. They can, not just in terms of, they've become wholesale retailers as a result of being able to bring things, merchandise through allied businessmen, and then they make a lot of money. The drug industry that they do, the cocaine, it's not just that they smuggle cocaine abroad. They have a local industry of methamphetamine pills that they do, what's called the Captagon pills.
We've heard about that apparently all the fighters in Syria are using these stimulants.
Yeah, on all sides, basically.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It's just uppers, basically. And they have a huge, obviously the hash industry is alive and well in Lebanon as well, and the tribes that run that are aligned with Hezbollah. So there's a lot of lucrative businesses that they do that is run out of Lebanon itself. So it's important, even as we look at it globally in Latin America and all the other stuff that brings them money, Lebanon itself is a central node in their money making.
And this isn't a rogue operation by some elements of Hezbollah. This is a part of the organization
which
itself.
Is why, we'll come back to that with Abdullah Safiyuddin, which is why his role in this is important to establish this hierarchy and who this person is and who his family is and what they are in the group. But just to relate this to the Iran deal, business empire of the supreme leader, which Abdullah Safiyuddin says is how Hezbollah gets its funding through the Iranians, it's no longer under sanctions. So and this is the same apparatus that makes money for the people who are killing people in the streets in Iran. It would behoove, the United States government, and hopefully the president will see this in the coming days, and reimpose sanctions on this business empire of Khamenei, because its impact is not going to be only domestically in Iran. It is going to be felt regionally, because that's part of the way they finance Hezbollah.
So I think that's one sort of point that's been underestimated, I think, in the discussion about the nuclear deal, is everybody says, well, this is just about nuclear, and
right.
we want to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Well, pursuing a nuclear weapon is not the worst thing that this regime does. It murders its own people. It has, these adventures abroad, and of course, as we saw with, the Marine barracks in Argentina, it does things around the world as well. Now, maybe to talk a little more specifically, we could go to Emanuele Ottolenghi, who is a senior fellow here at FDD, and he's an expert at its Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. Now, he spent the last couple of years looking in depth at what Hezbollah is doing in Latin America, and he actually has a piece that's upcoming in the Weekly Standard on this, which is great. So maybe you can talk about, how did you start looking there? We've got a great overview here from Tony. How did you start looking at Latin America and Hezbollah's work there?
So first of all, thank you and welcome everyone. It's great to see so many people here today. Iran is a revolutionary power. And as a revolutionary power, it aspires to export its ideology as a model of just Islamic governance, certainly to other countries and societies of Islam, but also beyond. And what's remarkable in this project that starts with the revolution in 1979 is that very early on, Iran identifies Latin America as a fertile ground for expanding and spreading its ideology. And why is Latin America so appealing to Iran in this project? Because the Iranians understand, and this is their brilliant insight, that they can market Hussein as an Islamic Che Guevara. And that's what they're doing. They come to Latin America and start spreading the ideology and win converts to the cause. They establish an infrastructure and they build alliances with political movements and eventually with governments. Alliances which enable, of course, the Iranians to expand their reach, to strengthen the infrastructure, and also to facilitate all sorts of activities, including the sinister, illicit ones that we're talking about. So they start very early on. What do? They send a cleric to Argentina, because in Latin America there is, a very robust Arab diaspora, but the Shia component of it is fairly small. Most of the Arab diaspora is Christian. Most of the Muslim minority in the Arab diaspora is Sunni. There are pockets of Shia communities. Argentina is one of the places where there is such a critical presence. There is a mosque, so they send a cleric to run the mosque. That's the cover. And the cleric basically comes back and says, like the dove with Noah's Ark, he found dry land. And they set up shop, and they do so incredibly efficiently, and they do so relying on the Shia, mostly Lebanese, diaspora communities, which at the same time are a target through Hezbollah of proselytism. Hezbollah is a rising force in Lebanon thanks to Iranian investment and support at the time in Lebanon. And they ensure that the Lebanese communities of Shia persuasion remain within the orbit of Hezbollah. So they send clerics, they send funds, they send resources, they establish schools, they establish cultural centers, which become a focus of attraction for these communities. They strengthen their identity. They ensure that the new generations stay in line. And of course, all of this is based on the fact that these diasporas community, regardless, especially the Shia ones, maintain very strong family links back to in the motherland. So oftentimes what you find when you look at these networks involving illicit finance, you discover that there is a cleric in Lebanon who's part of the senior leadership or the local leadership of Hezbollah, who has a brother who is running businesses in West Africa. There is another brother who's running businesses in the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay. And then maybe there is somebody else in the family, maybe younger people who go, spread out in Latin America or running businesses in Hong Kong or in the Chinese mainland. And the family dimension, the ideological commitment, and the religious pool together make this enterprise efficient, creative, ingenious, and global at the same time. And that's what they're doing. Now, we started looking at the most obvious and supposedly benign face of this activity, this apparatus, which was the mosques and the cultural centers, because by definition, these are visible public activities. And as you start scratching the surface, you immediately see both the presence of Hezbollah officials, Iranian officials, and their full degree of cooperation and interaction. And eventually, when the U.S. intel and law enforcement communities start investigating all of these cases that have to do with Hezbollah, whether it's drug trafficking or weapons procurement, counterfeited currencies, you name it, the law enforcement community, which is not driven by some grand policy project of redesigning the Middle East according to either democracy or making Iran a stabilizing factor in the region or what have you. The law enforcement community looks at the facts and lays them out in the documents which eventually will become public later on. And as early as 2008, 2009, you start seeing in these documents that the entire command structure of these operations involves political officials, clerics, social institutions, mosques, cultural centers, and the operatives who are part gangsters, part traders, who are in charge of the operations on the ground. And you can see a complete integration in the way these things are operated, in the way decisions are made between the Iranian leadership, the Hezbollah leadership, and the networks on the ground.
Now, Derek Maltz is a former DEA official who served as special agent in charge of DOJ, DEA, and the Special Operations Division. And as Toby mentioned, he testified just yesterday before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. And your testimony was great, titled Sanctions and Financial Pressure, Major National Security Tools. And so I was wondering if you could tell us, sort of explain to us, briefly what Project Cassandra is. And I was struck reading Josh Meyer's piece in your testimony. It seems that like any other investigation we've seen over the last number of decades in government, there's a lot of, different agencies have different priorities, and sometimes they're not great about sharing information, and sometimes it's not on purpose, and sometimes it is. And there also seems to be an interesting, sometimes tension between intelligence and law enforcement. Law enforcement has a specific duty to look at laws that are being broken, bringing people to indictments and such, whereas sometimes intelligence doesn't want that to happen because they are thinking they can use those people. So maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for everybody to be here today. It's a very, very important topic. I want to start off by making it real clear. I said it yesterday, and I'm going to say it again. Action speaks much louder than words. So you saw firsthand the Attorney General of the United States took immediate action to address this issue, and that has been my goal from day one. So I want to thank him publicly to recognize this is leadership that we need in this country. I also want everybody in this room to understand something before I even tell you any details, is that my motive from day one has been to create a better system for America, not to blame people, not to badmouth the administration before. And I always like to tell people this because it actually gives you some insight of why I am what I am. You see this here? That's my brother who died in Afghanistan looking to support and to fight for our freedoms, okay? He was the cover boy of the brochure. So his kids don't have a father anymore because of this global problem we have. So to answer your question, I was lucky in my life because I was able to have a father dedicated to law enforcement. My brother obviously served in the military. And I was actually asked to come down and run this operation here in Virginia called the Special Operations Division. Now, at the time, when I first got there were 9 agencies, but I had also worked there prior to 9/11 for 3 years. So I got a really good view before 9/11 and after 9/11. But what's really important to know is that I was there the day those damn planes hit the tower, and I watched the chaos in government not being able to connect the dots, okay? There's an old saying, right? If you want to connect the dots, you have to first collect the dots. Well, if the dots are scattered all over our government, they're no good. So when I was working at SOD, of course, the DEA's primary mission is to focus on the command and control of the highest level drug trafficking organizations in the world. And we started seeing a very disturbing trend around 2006, 2007, where we saw this mass amount of Middle Eastern guys in Colombia working with the remnants of the Pablo Escobar organization in Colombia. And what we noticed was there was a lot of Arabic conversations that were going on down there in the wiretap operations of the Colombians, and we really didn't understand it. As the head of the Special Operations Division, I never understood it. But what happened is we had some unbelievable work that was done. We wiped out an organization in Colombia, and we started realizing the magnitude of this thing around 2008. And so we saw this thing evolve. But let me go back to something really important. As a relatively new senior executive in the SOD, I went down and saw one of our country's best leaders, Admiral James Stavridis, at the Southern Command. He saw exactly what this man just described evolving and emerging. This unbelievable movement into Latin America of all these people from all over the world, that things were just really, very concerning to the great Admiral Stavridis. And he gave me a slide, a fireball. And he said his worst nightmare was when Islamic extremists and narco-terrorists come together. Well, as the head of SOD, I was paying attention to that. I had the best and brightest people. I was very, very fortunate. And then, of course, I'm reading headlines by our Homeland Security Director, how Hezbollah is making Al-Qaeda look like the minor leagues. Now, I'm not an expert on terrorism, but when my Homeland Security Director and my Admiral from Southern Command is saying that, I'm really concerned. So I see this massive drug trafficking activity. And at the time, and this is really important, the command and control leadership was coming out of Venezuela. And we had a very, very limited, intelligence stream out of Venezuela because of the corruption at the highest levels of the Chavez government. And then we found out about this man, Walid Makhled, who was sitting in Venezuela, paying the government officials in Venezuela to move these loads of dope all over the world. So now I'm starting to say, this is getting bad, right? And so as this thing evolved and emerged, right, we started seeing like law enforcement, had to get together and form strategies. So DEA had a 4-pronged strategy. And, we dealt with some unbelievable experts in the U.S. government from Treasury and from CBP and contractors to kind of help us understand what we needed to do. So what we needed to do is put together a unity of effort to go after this with the best and brightest that we have in this country. And we did that. But we didn't get full cooperation. That's another story. I could go on all day about that. But what did happen is I learned for the first time the power of the U.S. Treasury's, with the Patriot Act, the 311 action, the 981K action. It was unbelievable. And I was like learning through this. Like, I'm not one of these guys that they gave me the title and I have all the answers, right? I tried to learn, and I learned from the best and brightest. So what we did on one day is we told the world that the Lebanese Canadian Bank was operating this global thing because this is what they were doing. Cocaine coming from South America into West Africa. Drugs are being sold all over the world. Australia up to $300,000 a kilo. Cash going back into West Africa. Middle Eastern couriers flying back to Beirut, controlled like they said. I'm sorry, Tony, I'm sorry. I'm just so wound up today. In Beirut, they were controlling the airport with machine guns, watching the couriers bring the cash into the damn exchange houses. Then the money's going through the banking system, coming back to our backyard here in America, where used auto cart businesses all over America are taking the money out. And this is like this trade-based accelerated scheme right in our backyards. So now I'm like, as the head of SOD, I'm saying, I know all this stuff. I have to make sure everyone in the interagency is on this page, whatever. So then we actually had the best and brightest prosecutors in the world in Southern District of New York. We did a very powerful Patriotic 311 action, which I was told it's like a non-kinetic strike against Iran, and I love that, okay? And what happened was we actually then had them moving their monies around the world. So the Lebanese Canadian Bank was on the way. They were folding a little bit. They were getting nervous. They moved money over to another bank, Libano Banco Francés. And guess what? Through the 981K action, we actually seized $150 million. They wire transferred it to the Marshall's account like in one day. And we ultimately seized $102 million that went into the U.S. Asset Forfeiture Fund. Okay, so this is going on for a long time. So what Project Cassandra was it was an effort by my people at the Counter Narco Terrorism Operations Center at the Special Operations Division to consolidate the best and brightest that we have in America to go after this threat and do it at the highest levels, recognizing the sense of urgency. And we had a lot of cases, we had a lot of success, but there were a lot of things that happened that, you know, people don't want to talk about because they get defensive and they get like, why are they saying this? I'm not a whistleblower, okay? Let me make sure that's clear. What I am is a concerned father, very happily married, 3 kids, and I see what's emerging in the country and we need action. So Jeff Sessions, thank you for what you've done in one day that hasn't been done in my 10 years working at SOD.
Wow, that's a powerful account. You know, one thing I sort of wanted to touch on is a lot of Americans might hear about some of this stuff and wonder, well, does this affect us? Does this have anything to do with us? And you know, I'm thinking of so for example, John Brennan, when he was in May 2010, and he said that the administration was looking for ways to build up moderate elements within Hezbollah. And he says there's certainly elements that are concerned to us with what they're doing. We need to find ways to diminish their influence and try to build up more moderate elements. But then you talked about the arrests last June of the that was part of Project Cassandra, and so one person said that though those arrests bring into sharp focus that the Iranians are making contingency plans for when the U.S. turns up the heat on Iran. If they think it requires a military or terrorist response, they have been casing targets in the United States since the late 1990s. And one thing I learned from Josh Meyer's piece is that agents discovered an entire Quds Force network operating in the United States, laundering money, moving drugs, illegally smuggling helicopters, night vision goggles, and other items for Iran. And so I think I was going to ask each of you in your areas of expertise, what part of this operation, how does it affect people in America and the United States? And I'm sure you can speak to the especially the drugs aspect, and you guys can speak to some of the other stuff, because people might think, well, this is just stuff that's going on in the Middle East. It doesn't have anything to do with us, and that's clearly not the case.
Okay, so let's keep it real simple. Is there any business people in the room? Why do people get into business? To make money, right? And so if you have a commodity called cocaine, and you can sell it all over the world and make all kinds of money, and you have a low risk of going to jail if you send it away from this United States and our powerful laws, you're going to do it. So the South American drug entrepreneurs are smart, they're in business to make money, and they push it into other regions of the world. And bottom line is that they've recognized, these terrorist groups have recognized that this is an easy source of funding. Just like the FARC and just like the AUC in Colombia, when no one wanted to say they're terrorists, no one wanted to say that they were involved with drug trafficking. Bottom line is, it's all about the money. So they were first taxing people, controlling routes, controlling airports, controlling seaports, making big bucks, and then they realized how easy it was, and then the FARC and AUC emerged as this global drug trafficking organization. Well, these other groups like Hezbollah and others are operating like drug cartels, and bottom line is, that they're just smart. They're business people also. They recognize that funding streams are being shut off. They need cash, and drug trafficking and criminal activity is just a very easy way to make big money. That's it.
And so are some of those drugs reaching the United States and Europe?
Look at
the time.
Just
Every
go
day.
look at all the people that are dying. This opioid epidemic. We have kids dying all over America. We have drug task forces. We have the Attorney General putting together unbelievable initiatives to go after all. You know where all the heroin's coming that's killing these kids? From Mexico. Okay? Through the same cartels that have been bringing in cocaine into this country forever. So yeah, it's impacting everybody in this room. Probably knows someone who has died or somebody that's overdosed from opioids. Yeah.
Wow, that's again. That's something that's in the news a lot. But we're not seeing the connection.
They're not seeing the connection.
Now, now with the money that it's getting from this, what are some of the other things it's doing that affect people all over the world?
Well, I mean, let me start by saying that direct homeland security threats is not the only way we should be viewing the threat from Hezbollah. But even to that effect, right? These cartels, this kind of connection, the Iranian, Hezbollah, and drug cartel connection. Not long ago, there was an attempt by this triangle to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington.
Right here at Cafe Milano.
That's right. So, I mean, in an operation that would have doubtless killed there is money from these proceeds that Abdullah Safieddin was procuring to kill American soldiers. This is an organization that has a history of killing American diplomats and soldiers. So, I mean, this is on the direct impact in terms of security, but there's also stuff on the sort of more strategic level or political level. These guys are now embedded, have direct relationships with senior governments throughout, officials throughout Latin America. In the case of Argentina, it had a direct relationship to their nuclear program. In places like Venezuela and Colombia, obviously it has takes it back to the drug and security impact. In the Middle East, it has to do with the security of the American alliance system and the security of our allies and the rockets and missiles that are threatening people across the region and pose a direct threat to U.S. allies. So the nature of the threat. Because this is not people talk about Hezbollah. It's funny. This is an organization that's almost 40 years old, and people still don't understand what it is, right? And this is not. It's wrong to talk about Hezbollah in the way we talk about non-state actors. Hezbollah is not a non-state actor. Hezbollah is an arm of the Iranian government. That's what it is, right? So this is a state enterprise, and it always has been a state enterprise, which makes the nature, and this is not a poor state. This is a regional power with a lot of resources. So this is a completely different type of threat that, to my mind, dwarfs the non-state actor threat. So it is multidimensional, and it affects American interests from the direct national security or homeland security all the way to strategic and geopolitics and even non-proliferation issues.
Well, there was a great quotation from the lead coordinator of the Hezbollah cases for the DEA, who, talking about the group, says they were a paramilitary organization with strategic importance in the Middle East, and we watched them become an international criminal conglomerate generating billions of dollars for the world's most dangerous activities, including chemical and nuclear weapons programs, and armies that believe America is their sworn enemy.
Right.
Now, before we open it up to questions from the audience, one thing I was curious about is Josh Meyer's piece and your testimony, I think, as well yesterday, sort of highlighted how there can be different priorities in different government groups. Now, the sort of the main, I think, highlight of Josh Meyer's piece was how state and other executive branch departments had their priority was the Iran deal, and they didn't want to upset the Iranians, so they sort of pushed back on some of the DOJ and DEA things, and we could clearly see that. But what about foreign governments? Because it seems to me with a lot of this stuff, we're going to have to work with governments and law enforcement in other countries. And how hard is it to get them on side? And are their priorities different? I mean, again, we saw today the EU, they did not say a word about the number. There's been at least 50 people killed in the streets in the recent protests, at least 3,000 arrested, said not a word of them. And I think, Tony, you made a good point earlier that a lot of it is because European countries want to see their businesses tap into a new market in Iran. And so in each of your sort of areas of expertise, do we need to get foreign governments and foreign businesses on side, and how can we do that?
Well, if I can bring all of this together, let me start with a small anecdote and an example. Over the Christmas break, two jailed Hezbollah traffickers escaped from jail in the tri-border area. And 2 weeks later, the government that was responsible for their, for holding them to jail and putting them through the justice system, still hasn't released a request for red notices to the Interpol. Okay, now this speaks to one of the problems and why this is such a global priority. Here you have a perfect example of drug trafficking to fund terrorism that, in order to function, funds corruption across the board in Latin America in order to facilitate impunity for all of their operatives. So here we have a problem that, A, is a scourge to society, creates enormous social problems, economic problems, not just in the countries where the drugs are produced and sold, but elsewhere globally. It feeds into corruption. It destroys the environment, by the way. One of the things you're seeing in Latin America is this huge deforestation and disastrous environmental practices in order to basically create fields. This is something that is not really talked about, but something that should speak across the political spectrum. So the consequences are dire across the board. And the money that is generated by these activities, which fund corruption, disrupt society, create violence, which then increases the chances of people migrating from these countries to seek safe haven. So the immigration issue in this country, part of it has to do with what is going on in Latin America and the breakdown of societies, the corruption, the violence, and so on, which is tied to the drug cartels.
So basically every issue we're talking about in Washington, D.C. is somehow
somehow you can trace
there.
it back. And again, and the other part and the other anecdote is, of course, the last array of Project Cassandra was a case that was announced in early February 2016. And that was a case where cocaine from Latin America was being brought into Northern Europe through Amsterdam, was being sold across Europe, and the proceeds were directly funding the war in Syria. Okay, so again, a European, continent-wide refugee crisis fed by, yes, the inaction of the Europeans, the Americans, everybody else in confronting Bashar al-Assad and Iran in Syria, partly because of the Iran deal, but also funded by these activities. So it's kind of bizarre to actually hear officials saying, well, we had other priorities because, or in the scheme of things, the drug war maybe came second, because this is not just the drug war. This has to do with terrorism and with a whole host of global issues that should take precedence. And by the way, the Iranians were the ones with the weaker hand in the diplomatic game in 2013-14 because of the crumbling economy created by the sanctions pressure. So it should not have been an issue to be able to walk and chew at the same time, and it's a pity that we didn't.
One comment I would like to make is that I have firsthand knowledge of the amazing work that many people in the U.S. government were doing to look at this problem, right? So I don't want anyone to think like only little DEA was working on this. No, across the board with the intelligence community, DOD, and all of our law enforcement partners, we're all working every day. We're leaving our families behind. We're not going to sporting events and weddings because we're dedicating ourselves to public safety. The problem is the system is broken. So all you educated people out here, if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Ready? If terrorists are turning to criminal networks for funding, how is it that our system is still divided in our terrorist investigators over here, our criminal investigators over here, and they're not coming together? Does that make sense? So that is one thing that I want to make sure that is crystal clear. It's not the individual agencies. There's nobody sitting there going, oh, I don't want to share. No, there's some personality issues because that's life, right? Everyone in this room has some jerk at work. It's the same thing in the government agencies, right? But the point is that the system needs to be resolved. They have to fix it. And one last comment, because I want to say this. It may not be politically correct, and I don't really care because I don't play politics. But you know one guy that actually tore down the walls between drugs and terror, and it was featured in the New York Times, is Preet Bharara up in Southern District of New York. Go do your research. You know why? He recognized that this emergence of crime and terror were coming together. He wanted the best and brightest prosecutors in his jurisdiction to work on the biggest threats to the country. Wow, that's pretty smart, huh? Everyone should be doing it, but they don't.
Just a quick note on what you were talking about, European governments.
Sorry.
One of the issues in Europe also is a real fear that they are going to be targeted. So it's They have a lot of forces in Lebanon through the UNIFIL force, that Hezbollah has targeted before whenever they want to send messages. There was one particular case, the case of Ali Fayyad, for instance, who was caught and was in Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic rather, and they kidnapped Czech citizens in Lebanon, because that's what they do. They run the place, and they use them as leverage. But go back to just tie back to what Emanuele said earlier about the nature of how these guys work. They work together, right? The Iranians, cultural attachés, embassies, whatever it is, they work hand in hand with Hezbollah operatives. Go back to the Mykonos case, for instance, of assassinations in Germany in 1992. Iranian embassy personnel, Iranian intelligence personnel, Hezbollah operatives. And these guys and the Europeans, they don't want a rerun of the 1980s and early 1990s in European cities, whereby this state can come in and start bringing chaos to their streets, and they're powerful. So it's a business interest on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's good old-fashioned appeasement, basically.
Exactly. Well, it's great that we're seeing how interconnected everything is, and that's why I think the current debate: what should President Trump do about the nuclear deal? It's not just about nuclear weapons. It's what they're using this money to fund this whole thing that is involved in immigration and drugs and everything. We'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you could wait for the microphone and then let us know your name and what group you're affiliated with, that would be great if we could have right here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity. Roger Noriega with the American Enterprise Institute. I worked in the State Department for about 10 years and on Capitol Hill for about 10 years. I want to thank the DEA for your leadership on this issue. I know it's an interagency process, but you've certainly taken the lead, and our courts, prosecutors have done a terrific job on this. It pains me to say this, having worked for the State Department, but it seems to me there's a weak link here. In 2011, Walid Makhled was in the custody of the Colombian government, and he was not extradited to the United States, although the DEA wanted him. He was sent back to Venezuela, and he's in prison there now, still running drug activities. In 2014, we had Hugo Carvajal in custody in Aruba, and he was not sent to the United States, although we wanted him. He was sent back to Venezuela. In 2013, the State Department produced a report at the insistence of Congress on Iran's influence in the Americas, and they said it was waning. It seems to me, although everyone's more or less trying to be polite, there's a weak link here. And sure, the president calls the shots, but there's something wrong with the culture of, where witnesses who were trying to cooperate with the DEA were not getting visas.
So you think to
come to cooperate?
The State Department?
Can you comment? Can you comment on whether
I'd like to comment on
the
that.
State Department was a weak link, and what more Congress can do to hold those who were making those policies then accountable today?
Thank you.
Okay, so just to speak factually, right? Thank you, sir, for the question and also for pointing that out. So, what does the American public expect from law enforcement, right, to pursue these criminals pursuant to the rule of law, to let them come back and face charges? They have a right to a defense, right? They are not guilty, okay, until they're proven guilty. So what the Special Operations and the DEA and our interagency team has been trying to do all along is to arrest people like Walid Makhled, General Carvajal, Ali Fayyad in Czech Republic for one purpose: to take them off the playing field, bring them back to America, let the greatest investigators and intelligence community people debrief them for everything that they know, and then continue taking others off the playing field. That did not happen. Now, I don't have visibility as to why that didn't happen. That is something, and I would agree with you, that we need to look into why did that happen. But here's what I can tell you. You ready for this? Victor Boot was identified as a national security threat to me by Juan Zarate from the White House. He asked if the SOD people can go after Victor Bout and take him out because he was providing weapons to all these extremists and bad guys around the world. They had movies and books about him. He was a Russian arms dealer making billions. We did a sting operation. We took him out. He thought he was selling weapons to the FARC, but it was really DEA informants that were operating as, undercover FARC people. He wanted to kill Americans. That's what he was charged with and convicted in 6 hours and will be in jail for a long time. Guess what? Ali Fayed was arrested in the Czech Republic under the same type of sting operation, except here's the difference. He was connected to Hezbollah, and he also talked about he would be very happy to see a head of an American come back to him. But he was like, oh, the hostage thing, somebody talked about it.
Yeah.
So what's going on? I don't know. But I'd like to know because I saw the power of the U.S. government because the Obama administration for the Victor Bout, they came out of the woodwork and they were focused and they told the Thai government, get this guy back to America. This is legit. And it worked. I was so happy. We didn't see that with Ali Fayed. So what's going on? I don't know. I can't answer. Maybe some of you people in the room know the answer to that. But I'm not going to tell you that it was because of some nefarious conspiracy, because I'm not going to do that. That's not my job. My job is to give you the facts. The facts are the arms trafficker that wanted to kill Americans was brought back to America, but Ali Fayed, we'll let him go back to Lebanon.
All right, another question? Right back.
Would you choose?
Right there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sheena. I'm a National Security Fellow with FDD. I'm also active duty military. My question has to do with virtual currency. It's been used to conduct illicit transactions. Have there been any indications that Hezbollah is using or will turn to virtual currency?
I will take that. I am not an expert on virtual currency. As a matter of fact, my head is still spinning on how complicated it is. This Bitcoin stuff up to 20,000, down. I'm like, my kid's talking about it. But what I'll tell you is this. In Operation Silk Road, which happened many years ago, some really, really concerned U.S. citizens came to the attention of law enforcement and said, we have this deep web operation, selling drugs and selling weapons on this deep web. And all these bad guys around the world were making all kinds of money. They're using this Bitcoin thing. I never heard of it. The best and brightest of the FBI, of Homeland Security, of DEA and others, they attacked this thing and they shut it down. And that guy's out of business. He's in jail. Okay? As a matter of fact, no, that was the other case. Recently, they had Alpha Bay, which was another big case, dark web, Bitcoins, and cryptocurrencies. U.S. law enforcement working together, knocked them down, and the guy actually killed himself in jail over in, I think, Thailand because he knew he was done. So, to answer your question, I don't personally, because I don't work in the government right now, but of course, my opinion would be that not only is Hezbollah using cryptocurrencies, and not only is, all these other extremists probably because they don't want to go to jail. And they know that U.S. law enforcement and U.S. interagency people are a little limited in our knowledge in Bitcoin. We're learning, right? But I got a news for them. That I know from what I saw in those cases that we're going to come together on that in this country and we're going to start knocking them dead because you can't hide. So I'm sorry I can't answer on specifically on Hezbollah. But, that's something I'm going to look at with talking to my friends that are working the cases.
I think the answer is if it is highly lucrative, if it lends itself to speculation, to speculative practices, if it is unregulated, you can be sure that somebody, if they are not doing it yet, somebody is studying the file so that they can learn how to exploit it best. We are looking a lot at trade-based money laundering practices that Hezbollah is doing, mainly in Latin America, but the networks tend to be global. They're buying merchandise in China, and the level of ingenuity that you see in these schemes is incredible, and what they're using to make money out of these schemes is also incredible. It goes for anything that will yield money sooner or later. Hezbollah will be on top of it.
And remember, Hezbollah and these terror groups, they don't have a bureaucracy, they don't have a budget restriction, they don't have rules. They have one thing in mind, to carry out their agenda. Whereas the government agencies that work their butts off every day are still operating on laws from 1968, like in the wiretap business, We still have encryption now where we can't even penetrate encryption. The San Bernardino people, they're shooting up the poor innocent people out there, and then the FBI is trying to do the case, and we have industry saying, sorry, you're not getting into the iPhone. You're not getting in the iPhone. This is America. How can we allow these terrorists and these people to do this? We're not looking for more authorities in law enforcement. We want to protect people. That's what law enforcement do. They're not looking to, invade people's privacies. We love encryption. I love these toys. I'm on them every day. But we have to have the ability to have cooperative industry working with us to solve these complex problems. They can't be solved alone with law enforcement.
Yeah, right here. Yeah, bureaucracy moves slowly, and technology moves very quickly. Yeah, right. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I'm Dave Clark, from reporter from AFP. I think I better start with an apology. About 12 years ago, I bought a second-hand car on the Nigerian-Benin border. So it turns out, I didn't know, I probably contributed to Hezbollah's funding, it turns out. It was an Italian car, but I changed the plates very quickly.
If it was an Italian car, you're forgiven.
Yes.
Well, it was a German car, but it had Italian stickers on it.
That's worse.
We've heard a lot today, and I think it's undeniable that this Latin American connection gives Hezbollah a lot of access to important money. But running a drug cartel is also a dangerous business. And if the weight of this part of the operation develops, doesn't it give Hezbollah more freedom from Iran, for example, if they've got their own source of income? And then aren't they in conflict with other drug cartels? And they're on the streets dealing drugs, then they're more exposed than they would have been if they were a cellular organization.
So I'm just going to, with regard to the issue of independence from Iran, right? I mean, one of the things about the structure that we started, Emanuele and I described earlier on, is that there is no distinction in this case. Abdullah Safi-ad-Din is based in Tehran, right? This is where he runs this big enterprise.
And this is the cousin of Nasrallah, to let people know who that is.
Nasrallah's mother and Safi-ad-Din are cousins. So this is his brother is basically from 1994. Some accounts say Hashim Safi-ad-Din is so 1994. This is 92 was when Nasrallah became the Secretary General. By 94. Where was Hashim Safi-ad-Din? In Qom. He was brought back to Lebanon, and he becomes essentially the heir apparent. There is a vice deputy secretary general for Nasrallah, but he has no actual authority in the organization. Number two is Hashim Safi-ad-Din. So you're talking about I want you to see the layers. You have a family that controls the top echelons of the organization, and one of them is based in Tehran and runs the organization in Tehran. And what is the infrastructure that he relies on to run this organization? It piggybacks off of Iranian infrastructure, as the Iranians piggyback off of theirs through the social Lebanese ties and families and so on. One more point to this is that as the Lebanese-Canadian Bank case showed, and it's by no means the only case, this is a two-way street. Okay, think about drug gangs, mobs, right? What is the money-making scheme, right? If you are a subordinate to the top, you kick money up, right? Hezbollah not only takes money from Iran, Hezbollah kicks money back to Iran. Hezbollah is a money-making enterprise for Iran as well as Iran, just as Iran finances the group. So the Lebanese-Canadian Bank was an example of this. They were laundering money and they were holding accounts for Iranians in the Lebanese banking system. That's what that is. The entirety of Iran's Islamic revolutionary instruments, of which Hezbollah is one, but Construction Jihad, the Islamic Health Association or Commission, whatever it's called, the committee, the Imam Khomeini Relief Committee, the Imam Khomeini Reconstruction Committee for Lebanon, these are all Iranian institutions, most of which are cloned verbatim, just you change the name from Farsi into Arabic. And they exist and operate in Beirut. Some of them are funded by the Lebanese government, even in part, okay? Because they are quote-unquote NGOs. So this is, or whatever, they get from the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, and so on. So they operate in parallel, in tandem. So I think the idea of an independence goes back to the misconception of Hezbollah as a separate entity from Iran, something that is an ally or a proxy. I would argue, and my writing and research on this, which you can see, and to see the better case made for it, is that this is flawed. This is a flawed way of looking at this organization.
So one comment, only because the comment came up about working with international partners. I'd like to say, since you're from Australia, the Australian Crime Commission.
UK.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I thought you said Australia. But on that note, the Australian Crime Commission and the federal police have been big-time partners with the DEA on this Project Cassandra and have exposed incredible amounts of money laundering and drug trafficking in Australia from these groups.
Sorry, no, can I?
Well, the accent, and you got me with that accent.
Yeah, if I can just may add a point, because I mean you raised an important point. Isn't there a risk for Hezbollah at some point that they're going to sort of find themselves on the wrong side of the cartels? And I got to tell you, sort of in the research that we're conducting, we regularly see Lebanese in Latin America, washing up dead on the street with several bullets, in the wrong part of their body. And usually the reporting is that somebody tried to mug them, but the wallet is not gone, the mobile phone is not gone, and the mugger usually doesn't shoot them 42 times in the head. So you know that something's gone wrong. But I think that the even more interesting question is, why are the cartels using Hezbollah? And the answer is this. If you are the PCC in Brazil, or the Zetas in Mexico, or the FARC in Colombia, you may have by now achieved control over large swathe of territory in your own country. You have bought off all of the local politicians, the guards at the airport, or the customs, or the prosecutors, whatever you need to keep your guys away from the arms of the law. And you have this great sort of rat line bringing the drugs across the border into the next country where there is another cartel helping you out. What you don't have is two things. One, how do I get the coke from the port in Colombia, whichever there is, where they always hide them under banana cargoes and ship them off, to the distributor in Hong Kong or Australia? You may have some difficulties there. Number two, how do I bring the money back? Number three, how do I launder it through the financial system so that I can use it to buy my nice hacienda somewhere on the hills near Bogota? That's where Hezbollah comes in. Hezbollah is not competing with the cartels for control of the drug trade. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah is facilitating their drug trade, and sometimes they initially would take money for moving the drugs around. They by now are taking payment in kind. So when the shipment goes through Amsterdam or wherever it is that it's going, let's say 20% of that cocaine is for Hezbollah to sell. When the cocaine goes through the airport in Beirut, whoever is bringing it in, Hezbollah takes $10,000 a kilo. Okay, that's how they play. But their service providers, they are the Western Union and the Federal Express of the cartels in Latin America, and that's why the cooperation is so profitable for both sides. They're not stepping most of the time on each other's toes. They're facilitating. They're helping each other grow. So it's a joint venture with room for growth for both.
I wanted to say something. Oh. No, I just want to make something really clear, too, because I don't think this is very well reported. But back in the day when this Ababsiar, and I'm not the expert, and I'm not going to be the one to tell you all the background and details, but I know that many of you in this room may not know that the way we started that investigation in this country is when they came to a DEA informant in Houston, Texas, and wanted to cause all this devastating, basically trying to kill people and blow stuff up in our country, because they thought the Mexican cartels had this unbelievable capability. They thought our informant was a drug cartel enforcer. That being said, that was a textbook case, how when a criminal case identifies a terror network, how the criminal guys, DEA, went right to our partners in the FBI and the intel community to work this thing where we put them out of business and we identified something that everyone said, wow, they're in our backyard. The problem is reverse. When the terror investigations identify the criminal information, is it coming back down? And that has to be fixed.
Great question right there.
Dan Raviv with I-24 News. If I can put this to Dr. Ottolenghi, I'm wondering, in light of even the Attorney General's move this morning and putting some focus on narco-terrorism and Hezbollah, are you hoping, is it realistic that if the U.S. government really cares about this, which I guess would be a big change you feel from the Obama years, that that'll make a difference in the field, in the Latin American countries, for instance?
I would like to think so. I need to see how this half a paragraph of a statement that was released today turns out into a whole strategy. I mean, the strategy has been there for a long time. Derek can address that even better than I can do. But we have a national transnational crimes and its convergence with terrorism was identified by the Obama administration in 2011 as a national security threat. There is an executive order by the Obama administration addressing that threat. The Trump administration passed a new executive order on that subject in February 2017. We're already a year into a new set of foreign policy assumptions. So my question is, how are we going to move forward now that we have a task force? Are the best and the brightest going to be brought in? Are new resources being allocated for this effort? We have great legislation from 2015, HIFPA, which creates a whole set of tools for the government to go after Hezbollah financing. And it's, by the way, it's been used by the Obama administration to put pressure on financial institutions in Lebanon. I'd like to see pressure on financial institutions in Latin America, because I got news for you. The Hezbollah operations in Latin America are not flying the money out in bags of cash, flying out of the jungle with little planes and then getting on boats. And no, they're flying the dope through commercial aircraft into major airports, and are moving the money, the hundreds of millions of dollars that are generated by these activities, through the regular financial system. So I would like to see in the strategy a U.S. government that goes after the facilitators of Hezbollah in Latin America and starts targeting not just the criminals in the Hezbollah networks, but also the judges, the prosecutors, the law enforcement officials, the politicians of those countries who are taking bribes in order to turn the other way. The judge that has not issued a request for red notices on those two Hezbollah criminals that escaped on December 22nd and are probably already have gone to Lebanon, come back to Latin America and Lebanon again by now, I would like that person to have their visa denied. I would like to the United States. I would like that person to be designated. I would like to see the instruments that are in the law books to be finally used to this goal.
One point on that, too, I'd like to address. It's a good question. So, without mentioning the name, I personally know the person in the front office of the Attorney General's command that's going to be having oversight on this project. And I know he is a machine, he knows what he's doing, and he knows how to make this stuff work. So I can pretty much guarantee right now he will be giving it a 100% effort. And if anybody could do it, it's this particular guy.
I'm Josh Meyer from Politico. Thanks for reading my story, especially if you read all of it. Not sure my wife even did that yet, and she's a journalist. But first of all, I wanted to give my email if anybody wants to talk to me and has questions or whatever, or has information, of course, about it, just because I can't stay around afterwards. But it's jmeyer@politico.com. Or you can get it from other people here. But my question is sort of a follow-up to Dan's. It's an important enough question that I want to hear more about it, which is, maybe instead of talking about what is in the law that we can do, what else can we do that's not in the law? I mean, for instance, it took me a long time during my reporting before I figured out that one of the big problems is that we've never leaned on Lebanon to have an extradition policy, for instance. I mean, but so what else can be done, and can you guys talk a little bit about the sort of interagency stuff like Derek was saying, and I mean, do you think that sort of on an operational level, what can they do to actually do this?
Great.
So just with regard to the Lebanon aspect of it, I mean, this is one of the things that, the United States gives a lot of money to the Lebanese government and into its armed services, specifically, to the armed forces. As far as I know, there has been no identifiable ask in return for this money that in any way touches on furthering U.S. interest with regard to Hezbollah and Iran. Zero, nothing. Nothing on disarmament, nothing on capturing people who are roaming the streets free. And we're not talking about just military commanders. We're talking like somebody like Subhi Fayyad, for instance, who's been on the sanctioned list, who's been designated since what, 06? Or 06, yeah. So he's in Beirut. And a lot of these people
fly back and forth.
Fly back and forth. They have no problem moving. A lot of the suspects in several cases. I mean, the Trump administration recently put out this wanted, for two senior military commanders in Hezbollah that that they wanted for justice. Was it Hamiyeh and Fuad Shukr? Okay, can we maybe condition our aid to the LAF on them? Lebanon is this big, as you know, so it's like, and can we maybe use the intelligence network, or at least some of these people that we're giving money to actually get some of these guys, or condition for the extradition laws? And I think, this is one way of addressing it. Maybe instead of just giving money without any identifiable ask or furthering of U.S. interest, maybe that's one way to do it.
Hey, so one other point on that is that having been involved for a long time with the Drug Enforcement Administration and extraditions, like you talk about Colombia, who's been our best partner by far, taking the largest cartel members off the battlefield and sending them back to the U.S. and to face justice. But we're seeing that in Mexico now. I mean, look at the Chapo Guzman case. He escapes again, and we put him in jail. He's going to face justice in Eastern District of New York. Extradition is very powerful, but here's what I would say. You know what the U.S. government is terrible at? We have laws from 1922. No one dusts them off and say, do they still make sense? How can, like Lebanon, and again, I'm not an expert. I never worked in State Department. I'm not claiming to be an expert. But if you're giving them all this money and we have this global problem, what's wrong with saying, hey, can we extradite people? I don't know. Again, I'm not a politician with that stuff. But it makes sense that if these guys are global terrorists and criminals and we're working together and you want to show your good faith, well, if they are arrested pursuant to the rule of law, put them in the system, let them fight for extradition, and then bring them back.
We're almost done, so let's get two questions in. You ask them both very quickly, and then we'll answer them all together. So there, and then can we get one here as well?
Hi. My name is Vanessa Neumann. I own a counter-threat finance shop called Asymmetrica, because I used to work with the Asymmetric Warfare Group, and I'm the publisher of a book called Blood Profits, just came out last month, about my 9 years in the field chasing organized crime, funding terrorism through trade-based money laundering. Primarily, I started as a pissed-off Venezuelan, okay? And I'm a member of the Venezuelan opposition. One thing, I am going to make a point that is completely omitted in all of these conversations about Hezbollah. As a member, wearing my Venezuelan hat. I'm Venezuelan-American. I'm a dual citizen. We are furious about the dropping of Operation Cassandra. I was running around Washington, D.C. at the time saying that this was my country collapsing under a narco regime funding terrorism, which is not in the DNA of Venezuelans. We, the people of Venezuela, do not want our country involved in this. What has their foot on our throats of our people and 30 million of my compatriots starving and my friends in prisons being tortured. I had a friend commit suicide because he couldn't take the torture anymore. Okay? Is Hezbollah and Iran much more than Cuba and Russia. So, when you dropped that change in policy is very heavily inscribed on the bodies of 30 million of my people. That is the human cost of a bad foreign policy.
That's very. One more question, then you can
Okay,
answer them both together.
I'm not sure what the question.
Yeah. Go
Can you
ahead.
hear me? Yeah. My name is Jesse Sparrow. I'm Thomson Reuters. So I just, we work in threat finance. A lot of what we do is around AML related to Hezbollah as well and trade-based money laundering. And one of the things that we haven't talked about, I think that's important, is in terms of identity management and digital identity, that the Hezbollah members and a lot of these Iranians are able to get passports, citizenship, documents, I mean, valid immunity in some cases. I don't know what the solution is to that, because when they get the immunity, I think it was alluded to in the piece by Mr. Meyer that, you know, that is one of the ways in which they're able to enable, you know, continued narco-trafficking, trade-based money laundering, et cetera.
So two great questions that, you know, Vanessa there points out that, you know, Iran and Hezbollah have a lot more to do with what's going on there than Russia and Cuba. And question here is there anything we can do, and obviously working with foreign governments to try to stop that influence?
Well, going back to, excuse me, what was your name?
Vanessa.
Vanessa, thank you for the passion and for standing up for what's right. And so that's exactly how I feel. Like, you have experts like Vanessa who come from the country, and Mr. Noriega, who with his knowledge and everything, that have been studying this for years, and all these FDD people. And so it's not like rocket science, right? You know, it's emerging in that region. What are we doing? We're just watching it grow, watching it grow, watching it grow. So when we grab a General Carvajal, who is the head and director of military intelligence, working with all of these characters, we let him go back home. And when Matt Cled is arrested, the guy, go read the news on what he was saying from Colombian prison about his role and what he was doing. Just go read the news. Don't listen to me. His own words about his $1 million a month, paying off the government officials, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, we have to have the extradition. We have to have, like, one of the recommendations I've made is that designate somebody in Justice Department, whenever these high-level type extraditions are coming up, get your task force to be able to go through this stuff so we don't have a chance for these things to fall through the cracks. Bring them back here, get them off, you know, the playing field. But the thing is that that's the frustration. You saw the frustration of Vanessa, and that's the same frustration a lot of us in government, because this stuff is happening. It's emergency. There's no sense of urgency. Jeff Sessions did more today than I've seen in all these years. So God bless him. Thank you for doing that. So the thing is are we going to put the concept into action? That's going to be what we have to see, and hopefully we do, because of the frustrations and all the devastation and all the families that are being impacted, the opioid crisis in America. It's all related to everything we're talking about today.
No, I think that's a great way to end, is talk about how interrelated all of this stuff is.
Just
one thing from Tony here.
On this issue. I mean, this is another thing where in the case of the Lebanese government, right? I mean, Hezbollah is in the government. Hezbollah prints actual, authentic passports for aliases. They don't forge them. They actually can give you, okay, what has been the price that the Lebanese government has paid for this? I mean, I know in the Venezuelan case also they've been selling these things as well, documents and so on. So obviously, I mean, I'll leave that to Emanuele to address what could be done in that case. But in the case of the Lebanese government, again, I mean, what's going on? This is a very vulnerable, tiny state. I'm sure the United States has some form of leverage to be able to address that problem, because now you have a state apparatus that is being not, you know, complicit in, but directly involved in the operations of basically an IRGC unit on the Mediterranean. You know.
Emanuele, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I just want to add that you know, the issue of passports is something that I've been looking at from various angles for many years. I mean, again, one of the things that the U.S. government could do is start addressing and use its own political leverage with interlocutors in Latin America to address this problem. And again, I want to give you an example, which is also a hook to our story for next week, hopefully in the Weekly Standard. This is a story about a very senior Hezbollah official who you know, goes to heaven on October 2nd in a missile strike, apparently, or maybe an improvised bomb on the road in eastern Syria.
This is him right here.
That's him right here with a very senior figure in the Iranian regime, by the way. And this individual, turns out, has both Paraguayan and Brazilian citizenship, okay? And not only that, but although he's in eastern Syria fighting the war on the front line between the regime of Assad, the Iranians, and Daesh, he spent at least 5 years and maybe more in the tri-border area in Latin America. And you see that he's in contact with the top Hezbollah officials there. How do these people get passports so easily? There's a Hezbollah drug trafficker in jail in Paraguay currently who moonlighted as a facilitator for passport applications. He has facilitated the applications of more than 2,000 Lebanese nationals who are males, not to make any inference here, to become Paraguayan citizens since he moved to Paraguay in 1998. So, there is a structure in place that exploits the weaknesses of the systems in these countries to facilitate these networks. Right. And the least the U.S. government can do is exercise pressure and leverage and also offer help, assistance, cooperation to build capacity so that these countries can fix it. I want to give you one example, nothing to do with passports. I was in the tri-border area last time in November. I visited the drone base of the Federal Police of Brazil, which is supposed to sort of give assistance to their fight against narco-trafficking and contraband all along the frontier. Well, guess what? They have this beautiful drone they bought from the Israelis in 2009. It's been grounded since 2011 because they don't have the money to do the maintenance and to buy the update of software and so on. So a major tool which, with $300,000 of U.S. aid or assistance through the State Department could help the Brazilian government fix and thereby become more efficient in their war against the kind of narco-trafficking and contraband that feeds into terror finance. That would solve the problem or help alleviate the problem. And these are the types of things I think that our bureaucracy needs to start being a little more creative and ingenious at. And the other thing is, and again, we have to stop thinking regionally and in a compartmentalized fashion. Every time I go to the region, I meet with U.S. officials. They invariably speak Spanish and Portuguese, which is great because, right, those are the languages. But guess what? If you want to investigate these networks, and the example from Colombia speaks for itself, you need our law enforcement and intel agencies down there to have Middle East experts, seconded to the regional experts who speak the languages and understand the cultures, because the traffickers you're fighting against speak 5 languages, have 5 passports, travel around the world, and are much more experienced, clever, and creative than the tools we use to fight them.
And often the diplomats that are posted to these countries are part of their network. That's like the ambassadors, to Paraguay and Venezuela and so on and so forth.
Well, if I can just take a moment to plug the latest issue of the Weekly Standard, which has our cover story on the Iran protests with a piece by me and, of course, FDD Iran expert Ruel Margaret on the stands now. I have some copies. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming and the audience for such smart questions, and thank you to our panelists who are incredibly insightful and offered us the kind of information that's not just your overview, but stuff on the ground that's happening right now was great. So thank you.
Thank you.